Today marks 500 days since South Africa moved into a lockdown to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. South Africa has the 17th highest number of COVID-19 infections in the world, according to statistics from the World Health Organization. New Minister Joe Phaahla is said to have hit the ground running to speed up the country's vaccination program. But have we done enough to address the mismanagement of the pandemic from a health and economic front? We're now joined by political analyst Friedman to unpack more on the matter. Professor Friedman, good morning. Thank you for speaking to us. 500 days on. Key highlights for you. Professor, can you hear me?
I lost you for a moment, Hugo, but you're back now.
Yeah, I can hear you too, Professor. Just confirming, key highlights for you over the last 500 days of that we've had of lockdown.
Well, Hugo, I'm afraid the reality is that we just have not done very well. Right now, if you look at the third wave of the Delta variant, you made the point that I think we're the 17th highest in the world. But if you actually calculate population, in other words, if you work out COVID-19 cases as a percentage of the population, our situation looks a lot worse. In fact, you will remember that there were pictures all over the world of the pain that was caused in India. If you actually adjust for population, our rates of infection are not that different to India's at all. So we haven't done well. And in my view, the reason we haven't done well is not mismanagement, but a strategy which gave up at the beginning. Shortly after COVID-19 arrived on our shores, Professor Karim, who was then the chairman of the Medical Advisory Committee, announced that we would have a severe epidemic. His colleagues, the scientists, joined in and agreed with him. Now, obviously, if you start believing you're going to have a severe epidemic, you will have a severe epidemic. So there was no real commitment to actually fighting this virus in the way it should have been fought, because the scientists believed at the beginning that it was impossible. The politicians joined in. The former minister announced that 60% of the country would get infected. He didn't say how he'd arrived at that. He didn't say what he based that on. But from the beginning, we've had this huge defeatism, which means that we haven't tried as hard as we could. And if you don't try as hard as you can, you don't do as well as you can.
Now, let's take a look at the vaccination drive, which seemed to dither for much of the last year, but seems to have gained momentum. Certainly a positive.
Actually, yes, we have gained momentum. I actually don't agree that there was all that much dithering. I think the claim that there was dithering was based on the same sort of attitudes which produced the defeatism. And these are attitudes which say, if you don't behave like some North American or Western European country, then you're going to fail. I have written quite a lot on this, but the reality with the vaccine is that if governments had done what the scientists wanted to do on the vaccine, it would have been denouncing it on the media. Because the reason the rollout was slow initially is that government followed all the rules. It had to make sure that every vaccine which was going to be used was passed by the national regulator, the South African Health Products Regulator. If it hadn't have done that, it would have got shouted at. When it did do that, it did get shouted at. And I've actually, in some things I've written recently, gone into some detail about how negatively the government would have been viewed by the scientists if it actually done what they told it to do. So I don't think the vaccine is the problem. I think if you look internationally, we're not doing that badly. I think the vaccine will gather momentum. But of course, we all know that vaccines are very important, but they're not the only tool in our toolbox when we fight COVID-19. So, you can start to roll out vaccines. You can do very well. But besides anything else, the majority of the population is not going to be vaccinated for quite a while because it's just not physically possible to get injections into everybody's arms in time. So you've got to have other measures. And really, we seem now to be relying purely on the vaccine and on a few fairly obvious measures, like mask wearing, which are better than nothing, but not nearly what we could be doing to fight this virus.
Now, on the back end of the 500 days, Dr. Joe Phaahla has been appointed to that portfolio of health. Great positive, seen to be to have hit the ground running, Professor.
Look, from everything I've seen, he's a very competent person. I'm sure that he will do a good job within the framework that he's operating. But given my concerns that we should be working far harder to fight this, my concern is that he will simply take the same view as his predecessor and the whole scientific establishment. Unfortunately, we're not dealing here with a minister who got it wrong. We're dealing with a whole series of decision makers who seem to believe that if you don't have the same chemical type of medicine as they have in North America and Western Europe, you can't fight a virus. And if you look around the world, that's simply untrue. So I wish Dr. Phaahla well. I think that he's the right person for the job. I'm just hoping that he will break with the kind of attitude that we've seen for the last 18 months. Because unless he does, we're still going to wake up every morning, as we do, to those very large numbers of cases and even worse news of hundreds of people who passed on.
Now, in your mind, who have been the biggest losers politically of this lockdown?
Well, I'm not sure in the end that they were political losers, because really what has happened is that there hasn't been any accountability. And that's part of the reason we're in the situation we're in at the moment. So you would expect the scientists, because they are fulfilling a public function, they're making decisions which could decide literally whether people live or die. You would expect them to be subjected to very careful criticism from politicians, from media, from civil society organizations. There hasn't been a word, not a single word. I'm not aware of a single critical question which has been asked of the medical scientists throughout this pandemic. And although there have been a lot of grumbling about government, or certainly about government corruption, which is a legitimate concern, but we tend to think that the only problem in this country is corruption, where it's one among many problems. The actual way in which the government has fought the virus has not been held accountable. And I'll give you just one quick example. One of the reasons we couldn't fight this adequately is because you need to test and trace contacts. And cases really backed up at the national laboratory. And that means you can't fight the virus, because if you can't get the test results back, how do you trace the contacts? Government was never held accountable for that. Nobody ever said, why is this happening? Nobody ever said, but this is going to cost lives. People simply shrugged it off. And obviously, if you have no accountability, there are no political prices to be paid. The opposition was never asked, the DA and the EFF were never asked to justify their positions. So in effect, we've had a situation where people in authority have been able to take decisions free of accountability, and that means there are no political losers. But unfortunately, there's one huge loser, and that loser is the people of South Africa, who didn't get the response to the virus which we were entitled to.
Now, some of the other people that have lost are those in schools. The level of disruptions to schools and the education system has been astronomical.
Well, of course, but that's been the case everywhere. That doesn't make it right. I'm simply saying that if you have a coherent plan from the start, then you don't have what we've had with schools and what many other countries have had with schools, which is that people are reluctant to send their children to school because they don't know whether it's safe. Well, if you can't reassure them that it's safe, why should they send their children to school? If you keep on changing your mind, and interestingly, one of the problems here is that many of our decision makers really want us to be like Britain. Well, we have been like Britain because Britain also keeps on changing their mind and telling people one day that the schools will open and another day that they won't, and causing huge amounts of
Professor, allow me to come in there, please. I mean, you talk about us or the government continually changing their minds, but the landscape is one such that none of this has ever happened before, firstly. Secondly, there's a heavy reliance on what's happening in other countries, and it appears that information that becomes available continues to change, almost the same way that the variants change themselves.
Yes, but Hugo, why are the only countries we're interested in the United States, the UK, and a couple of other Western European countries? Why didn't we try and learn from South Korea? Why didn't we try and learn from New Zealand? Why didn't we try and learn from a whole lot of African countries who for quite a while maintained far lower levels of infection than we do? So I'm all for learning, particularly, as you correctly say, for an entirely new virus. I think it's very revealing that our decision makers only want to learn from one part of the world. And what makes it even more revealing is that the part of the world they want to learn from is the one which is doing pretty badly. We don't want to learn from the parts of the world who are doing very well. And it seems to me that that's very revealing because it shows you which parts of the world our decision makers take seriously and which they don't. And I'm afraid the continent on which we happen to live is one of the places they don't take seriously, because there was no attempt to find out how countries which had experienced Ebola, for example, were able to do better at tracing people than we. So, yes, we do learn from other countries, but I think which countries we choose to learn from tells us a great deal about ourselves.
Professor Friedman, thank you so much for your time this morning. Political analyst Stephen Friedman. And one of the key highlights of that conversation certainly is that the government has not looked to countries, certainly on this side of the equator, at problems that they face and how they have solved them, seemingly to focus on countries that are struggling with similar problems.